All right, this video is going to be focused on John Stuart Mill's argument for utilitarianism in his book, Utilitarianism. So we're going to be looking at the excerpt from that book that was assigned as part of class. And in this book, his argument for utilitarianism is really a response to an objection against it. So John Stuart Mill, who is a very famous utilitarian, one of the most prominent founding members of utilitarianism, certainly a leading proponent of the theory, is going to do what all good thinkers do. He's going to look at someone who disagrees with utilitarianism, who thinks that utilitarianism is wrong, and then he's going to make the argument that, in fact, utilitarianism is right. Now, what is this argument all about? Essentially, this argument is going to be about the quality of happiness that we can receive from the actions that we perform. And so he wants to talk about the nature of what happiness consists of. And so utilitarianism, to kind of pull back a little bit, the fundamental goal of utilitarian is to make the world a happier place. And that seems like a very simple proposition. Look at what my action is doing, look at who it impacts, and then just go with the action or the rule or the behavior that produces more good than bad. Okay? Seems simple enough. But in practice, it becomes very, very difficult. Well, who is this action going to impact, for one? To what degree is it going to impact them, for another? How long is it going to impact them, for a third? And then the fourth is, well, what kind of happiness is being produced? And this is really where John Stuart Mill's argument takes place. And the argument itself, so I'm going to read from some of the passage and then kind of go over it, is written in a way that I find very beautiful, but contemporary readers would often struggle with. It's written with a language and a style that we're not used to. So I'm going to kind of read it, and then take some time to just unpack what he's saying there. So from Utilitarianism, Chapter 2, what utilitarianism is. So he says, the creed, which accepts as the foundation of morals, utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure. Okay, so here, this first one, he's just saying the creed, so utilitarianism, the theory, which essentially holds that actions are right if they produce happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse, as they pretend to produce pain or unhappiness. So essentially, the idea is the good person makes the world happy, the bad person makes the world less happiness. And then he just goes on and he says, by happiness is intended pleasure in the absence of pain, by unhappiness, pain in the privation of pleasure. So that ties together happiness and pleasure and pain and unhappiness. Utilitarians look at them as very, very closely related. Okay, so then he's going to go on here. Now, in the second full paragraph of the reading, he says, such a theory of life, so he's talking about utilitarianism, a theory of life, excites in many minds, and among them, in some of the most estimable in feeling and purpose, inveterate dislike. All right, so that is, a lot of, some big words, some words that we don't often use in contemporary society, but what he's saying there is, look, this theory of utilitarianism excites, generates, produces in many minds, and some of those that are the most noble that we'd consider in society, the highest up, the most esteemed, the elites, those kind of people, the intellectuals perhaps. He's saying that, look, oftentimes they're really pissed off by utilitarianism. They don't like it. They hate it. They have this kind of emotional reaction. It produces this inveterate dislike, this deep-seated anger or aversion to it. They just don't like it at a very deep level. But why not? Why don't they like it? So here is the critique. Here is why utilitarianism is wrong, according to these critics. To suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure. They designate it as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine worthy only of swine, to whom the followers of Epicurus were at a very early period contemptuously likened. Okay, so what he's doing there, or what the critics are doing, is they're essentially comparing utilitarianism to animals. Like, if you live as a utilitarian, you're essentially living like an animal. You're living like a pig, a swine, he calls it. Then why is that, right? Well, the critics are going to say, if utilitarianism is based on the idea of maximizing happiness, and happiness equals pleasure, and minimizing pain, or unhappiness, and unhappiness equals pain, well, then what you essentially have is people that are pursuing pleasure. And for the critics, that is to live as an animal, to do what feels good, to just follow your inclination, to follow your instinct. All of that would be a result of living life according to pleasure and avoiding pain, according to the critics. So they view utilitarianism as essentially a moral theory that says live like animals, do what feels good, avoid what feels bad. And that strikes these critics as being very profoundly anti-moral. To live just for purely sensual pleasure, that's going to be a problem. Okay, now in class, what I would often do at this juncture is to say, all right, close your eyes and imagine you just won the biggest lottery in the history of the world. You just won more money than you could ever spend in your lifetime, or your kids' lifetime, or even your grandkids' lifetime. What do you do? And it's interesting. I mean, the responses tend to be fairly mixed. Some people say, all right, I would, go on a permanent vacation, buy the big house, live in luxury, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I would just enjoy life. I would just not do any work, right? So you've got that kind of life, that playboy, lavish, hedonistic life, a life where you live for just purely sensual pleasure. Others say, I would, I'd pay off debts, that's always a big one. And I would also then, have a job, get a job in a career that I love. And I often ask, would you finish school? Some people would say, no, I'm out of here, goodbye. That was my last day of class right before I won the lottery. Others say, no, I would finish it out. I would get my degree, even though I don't need that money. And John Stuart Mill would be in the position of saying those that choose to pursue, finish their education, pursue a career, something like that, those individuals are right. Those individuals are doing what we ultimately would naturally do. So let me go back to the reading itself and draw out this notion of why John Stuart Mill would take this position. He says, when thus attacked the Epicureans, and so for this passage, Epicureans and utilitarians are going to be very closely related. So if he says Epicureans, that's also a reference to utilitarian theory. So when thus attacked, when critics say that, look, utilitarianism leads to you living like an animal, living for pure sensual pleasure, the utilitarians or the Epicureans have always answered that it is not they but their accusers who represent human nature in a degrading light, since the accusation supposes human beings to be capable of no pleasures except those of which swine are capable. If this supposition were true, the charge would not be gainsaid, but then would no longer be an imputation. For if the sources of pleasure were precisely the same to human beings and to swine, the rule of life which is good enough for the one would be good enough for the other. The comparison of the Epicurean or utilitarian life to that of beasts is felt as degrading precisely because the beast pleasure do not satisfy a human being's conceptions of happiness. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. Okay, again, language and vocabulary we're not always used to, sentence structure that's a little bit more complex. But at the end of the day, what he's saying here is really interesting. He's saying that criticism of utilitarianism does feel like it hurts a little bit because we don't want to live just purely as an animal. But John Stuart Mill is saying, well, why does it hurt? Why are we offended in some way? And his answer is that precisely because we would not be satisfied living a life of pure luxury, pure sensual satisfaction, just waking up every day and sitting in the sun, or, having our drink or having sex or just relaxing. It sounds great and it's wonderful for a brief period of time. That's why we love to go on vacation. That's why vacation feels so good. But at the end of the day, that would get old. We wouldn't find fulfillment and satisfaction in it. And so that's the problem with living for pure sensual pleasure. It is a life that could never truly satisfy us, never make us happy. It can give us pleasure for a little bit, but doesn't give us true, genuine fulfillment. Just think about the difference between the happiness or the pleasure you might feel going out for a night on the town, getting wild, enjoying yourself, versus the pleasure that you might feel when you graduate college, especially if that was a hard and difficult road for you. It wasn't a given that you were going to finish. It required sacrifice, maybe sacrifice for yourself and your family. It wasn't just about you. Think about how you feel after you've been involved if you're an athlete, right? And you've gone through a season, you've worked really hard and you've sacrificed and you've the blood, sweat, and tears, and you've gone through the ups and downs with your team. And then you get to the end and, maybe you win the championship or maybe you don't, but your team plays as well as they could and you play as well as you could. That profound satisfaction that you feel is much higher, much more valuable, Mill will say, than any kind of just temporary pleasure. Think about if you're in a play or you're a musician, right? And you get to your big performance after all those practices, all those, days spent mastering your craft, mastering your line, mastering the music. And then you get to that performance and it comes out. That achievement, that fulfillment is something that is a higher level of happiness, a higher level of pleasure. And so John Stuart Mill is going to say, look, the critics of utilitarianism are wrong because if we base life on maximizing happiness and pleasure and minimizing pain and unhappiness, we won't just live for pure sensual satisfaction. We will ultimately be driven to do things that give us a deeper sense of satisfaction. And so the lottery winner living in the lap of luxury would be happy for a while, but as studies have proven, or many accounts have kind of communicated, oftentimes those lottery winners after a period of time are not happy. Sometimes they're often miserable. And for John Stuart Mill, that makes sense. The only thing that can make us happy is a deeper form of satisfaction, a sense of spiritual fulfillment, emotional fulfillment and satisfaction, intellectual knowledge. When I can understand myself and my world and those around me at a deeper level. That's ultimately what we're driven for. So if we say maximize happiness, for John Stuart Mill, it can include these lower level happiness. I mean, certainly, having a good meal, sitting out in the sun, that produces pleasure and that's real. But if that's all that there is, we're not going to be satisfied. So to make the world a happier place in John Stuart Mill's view means that for human beings, it has to include both the physical and the sensual, but also the higher level pleasures. So a world that is not gratifying and satisfying these higher level pleasures is ultimately a world that we will not be content with. And so utilitarianism, far from driving us to live simply as animals, drives us to create a culture and create a life that involves these higher level capacities. And that is in the essence John Stuart Mill's response to the critics of utilitarianism. And it also illustrates how happiness for John Stuart Mill is not uniform. It's not just like there's this one kind of happiness. There's different levels of happiness. And we ought to strive for a higher level of happiness. And I'll leave you with one kind of final example of this. So John Stuart Mill says, we would rather we wouldn't trade our life for the animal life. Like if you were given a choice, I often kind of tell the story in class where I was driving out with the rugby team into Lancaster, and it was a beautiful kind of March morning. The sun was shining, a little crisp, but still warm. And we drove over this hill, and unfolding before us was this farmland. And I looked out and I saw this little pond, and I wondered to myself, what would it be like to live as a duck? Would I trade my life for the life of a duck? Give up all the stresses, all the anxieties, all the pressures that we endure in human life, the failures, the disappointments, and just live as a duck. Like, where the only thing I got to worry about is waking up in the morning, finding some food, enjoying my life. And for John Stuart Mill, we wouldn't do that. We wouldn't trade that life. It might seem attractive, especially it might seem attractive when you're in the midst of high stress or, you're enduring some acute psychological, spiritual pain, right? Somebody's broken up with you, you've lost a job, the life path that you thought you were going to go on doesn't work out. Like, that can be really, really powerfully painful. Just as spiritual pleasures and happiness are higher, so too is spiritual pain deeper and emotional pain. But he says, like, in those moments, we might be tempted to give up our life. But at the end of the day, human beings wouldn't do it because we recognize at some level that the life of an animal is inferior to the life of the human being. And it's inferior because we have this capacity for this more profound sense of happiness. So that is, again, kind of John Stuart Mill's, argument. Other questions that arise as well, if we really are driven by this, profound sense of happiness, why is it that some people seem to live according to lower pleasures, right? Some people are addicts, right? They pursue and base their life on the pleasure that a drug or a alcohol would give them. And so John Stuart Mill would say, all right, well, there's a couple different reasons here. One is sometimes the lower level pleasures are easier to satisfy. So sometimes we'll satisfy them out of convenience. He'll say that in some environments, and this is really kind of a socio-political discussion and perhaps a tragedy, some people live in environments where their higher level faculties are not developed. And so they haven't been trained and developed enough to enjoy these higher level faculties and events and experiences. And that's kind of a tragedy. He also says that we can become addicted to these lower level pleasures, essentially, and we pursue them not because they're higher or better, but because we're driven. We have these urges to satisfy that kind of longing. All right, so I'll end it there. I said between 10 to 15 minutes, so I'm a little bit over that, but not too much. And that is, again, John Stuart Mill and Utilitarianism.